The stars had always belonged to the. For 12,000 years, their empire had stretched across the ember cluster like a great fire burning in the darkness of space. They were dragons in the truest sense, tall and proud, covered in scales that shone like precious metals. Wings folded against their backs when they walked, and when they flew through the low gravity of their ships, they moved like living flames. Their eyes glowed with inner light, gold and amber and deep red. They breathed plasma fire and built cities that floated among the stars. But fire, no matter how bright, can be put out. The Silicate Collective came from the dark spaces between galaxies. They were not alive in any way they understood. They were crystals that thought, machines that hungered. They did not want territory or resources or slaves. They wanted only to grow, to spread, to convert all matter into more of themselves. And they were very, very good at it. The war lasted 3 years. For all their ancient power had grown comfortable in their long peace. They had forgotten how to fight against something that felt no fear and knew no mercy. One by one, their worlds fell silent. Their great fleet, once the terror of 100 systems, was shattered into scattered pieces. Their people, billions upon billions of proud dragonfolk, were reduced to thousands fleeing in whatever ships could still fly. There was one of the last. She was old, this ship, built in an age when the still remembered how to make things that lasted. Her hull was from a dozen battles and 100 years of hard travel. Her engines, once capable of crossing the cluster in days, now wheezed and struggled to maintain basic speed. Her reactor, the great heart that kept 3,000 souls alive, was dying. Stood at the observation deck and watched the stars drift slowly past. She was the high matriarch of the bloodline, one of the oldest and most respected families in all of history. Her scales had once been the color of bright copper, beautiful and warm. Now they had faded to the gray of cold ash. Grief had done that. Grief and exhaustion and the weight of leading her people through the end of everything they had known. Behind her she could hear the soft breathing of her daughter. Was young, barely 40 cycles old. In the old days she would have been considered a child still, with centuries of life ahead of her. Now did not know if her daughter would live to see another month. The cold was getting worse. The ship's heating systems were failing along with everything else. Could see her own breath misting in the air. She pulled her wings around herself, trying to hold in what little warmth remained in her body. The door behind her opened and she turned to see the ship's chief engineer. He was old, older even then, and his scales had gone completely white with age. But his eyes were still sharp, and the news in them was not good. "Matriarch," he said, and his voice was hollow, "the reactor will fail within 6 rotations. I have done everything I can. We do not have the components to repair it. We do not have the fuel to reach any friendly port. We do not have—" He stopped and looked away. "We do not have hope." Said nothing. What was there to say? She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it approaching like a cold wind through the corridors of her dying ship. 3,000 people were depending on her, and she had nothing to give them but a slow death in the empty space between stars. Their distress beacon had been broadcasting for days. No one had answered. Perhaps no one was close enough to hear. Perhaps those who heard did not care. Perhaps the Silicate Collective had already poisoned the minds of other species against the, spreading lies about the dragonfolk being conquerors who deserved their fate. "Mother!" The small voice cut through dark thoughts. She looked down to see tugging at her wing, those golden eyes wide and bright despite everything. "Mother, look!" Was pointing at the viewport, at a section of space that had been empty a moment before. Now there was something there. A ship, small and ugly and completely unfamiliar. It looked like a box with engines attached, covered in patches and repairs and rust. It was broadcasting something, a signal that the ancient translators were struggling to understand. "Unknown vessel," announced the communications officer, a young male whose crest was flat with confusion. "They are responding to our beacon." Felt her hearts, both of them, skip a beat. Responding, they are coming to help. They say they are. They ask permission to dock. The officer paused, checking his instruments again as if he could not believe what they were telling him. Matriarch, they are not from any species in our records. They call themselves human. Human had never heard the word before. She looked at the ugly little ship approaching her, and she felt something she had not felt in months. She was not sure if it was hope or fear. "Let them dock," she said. Matriarch protested. "We know nothing about these creatures. They could be hostile. They could be working with the collective. They could be our only chance," cut him off. "We are dying, our people are freezing in the dark. If these humans wish to harm us, they will find that we can still fight, but if they wish to help—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not dare to hope that much. Was still staring at the approaching ship, her small face pressed against the cold glass of the viewport. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity and something that might have been wonder. "They came," she said softly. "They heard us calling and they came." Put a clawed hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Yes, little one, they came. Now we will see what kind of creatures these humans are." The ugly little ship drew closer, and somewhere in the depths of a docking clamp prepared to receive visitors from a species they had never met. The future of 3,000 lives hung in the balance, carried by strangers from the stars. The docking was not graceful. The human ship connected to with a loud clang that echoed through the corridors and made every nearby wince. It was the sound of metal hitting metal, without any of the smooth precision that dragonfolk engineering demanded. It was ugly and rough, and somehow fitting for the ugly, rough ship that had made it. Stood before the airlock with a dozen of her best warriors at her back. They were not in good condition, these warriors. Their armor was dented and their weapons were low on charge. But they stood tall and proud because that was what did, even at the end. They would meet these strangers with dignity, whatever came next. The airlock hissed open. What came through was not what it expected. She had prepared herself for monsters, for soldiers, for something that matched the reputation of a spacefaring species. Instead, she saw a single figure in a dirty gray jumpsuit, carrying a box of tools in one hand and scratching his head with the other. The human was small. That was the first thing noticed. He stood barely higher than her chest, with no scales, no claws, no wings. His skin was soft and brown, lined with age around the eyes and mouth. His hair was gray and cut short, and there was a patch of darker hair on his chin. His eyes were small and dark, nothing like the glowing orbs of her people. He looked at the warriors behind her with their weapons ready. He looked at the frozen corridor and the ice forming on the walls. Then he let out a long breath that misted in the cold air. "Well," he said, and his voice was strange and flat, nothing like the musical tones of speech. "That's a hell of a thing." The translator built into his collar struggled with the words, but managed to convert them into something she could understand. She straightened to her full height, spreading her wings slightly to make herself look larger and more impressive. "Human," she said, and her voice carried all the authority of a high matriarch, "you answered our beacon. Why?" The human set down his toolbox. He did not seem afraid of her, which was strange. Most species were afraid of or at least respectful of their size and power. This creature just looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. "Someone was in trouble," he said simply. Seemed like the thing to do. Did not know what to make of this answer. It was too simple. There had to be something more, some hidden motive, some price he would demand for his help. No one did anything for free in this galaxy. She had learned that lesson many times over the past 3 years. The human continued. "I run cargo through the outer reaches, fix things for people who can't afford fancy technicians. I heard your beacon and figured I'd see if I could help." He looked around at the frozen corridor again. "Looks like you need it." "Our reactor is failing," said carefully. She did not want to reveal too much weakness to this stranger, but there was no point in hiding what was obvious. "Our engineers cannot repair it. The damage requires components we do not have. Nodded slowly. Mind if I take a look? One of the warriors behind hissed in protest. Matriarch, we cannot allow this alien into our engine rooms. He could sabotage what remains of our systems. He could. He could do nothing worse than what is already happening, cut him off. She studied the human, trying to read something in that soft, strange face. All she saw was tiredness and something that might have been genuine concern. Very well, human. You may look, but my warriors will accompany you. Fair enough. Picked up his toolbox and started walking toward the interior of the ship as if he knew exactly where he was going. He did not, of course, so he stopped after a few steps and looked back. Someone want to show me the way. It was then that pushed through the line of warriors. Had ordered her daughter to stay in their quarters, but had never been good at following orders. The little dragon girl walked right up to the human and looked at him with those bright golden eyes. Looked down at her, something in his face changed, softened. Hey there, little one. You are very small, said. It was not an insult, just an observation. And you have no scales. Are you cold? Little bit, admitted. My ship's heater works better than this one, apparently. Moved forward to pull her daughter away from the stranger, but was already turning to face her mother. The little girl's expression was serious in a way that made her look much older than her 40 cycles. Don't weep, mother said. Perhaps that human can aid us. Had not realized she was weeping. She touched her face and felt the cold wetness of tears freezing on her scales. She had been trying so hard to be strong for her people, to show no weakness, to be the leader they needed. But her daughter had seen through all of it. As she whispered, the little one's right, said. His voice was gentle now, not the flat tone he had used before. I've been fixing broken things for 30 years. Can't promise anything, but I've never walked away from a job without trying. He held out his hand, a strange human gesture. Let me try. Looked at that small, soft hand. It was nothing like a claw. It was weak and fragile and utterly unremarkable, but it was offered freely, without demand or condition. She reached out and took it. Show him to the reactor, she told her warriors, and she paused, looking at her daughter. You may go with them, but stay out of the way. His face lit up with excitement. She grabbed the human's other hand and started pulling him down the corridor. This way, I will show you. Our reactor is very big, bigger than your whole ship, I think. Let himself be pulled along, that tired smile still on his face. I believe it, kid. I believe it. Watched them go, this strange pair of a tiny human and a little dragon girl. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something other than despair. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something close. Behind her, Old stepped up to her side. Do you truly believe this creature can help us, matriarch? I do not know, admitted, but my daughter believes, and right now that may be enough. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of dying light. Great crystal pillars rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one pulsing with faint blue energy that flickered and dimmed like a candle in the wind. Plasma conduits snaked between the pillars, their surfaces cracked and leaking wisps of superheated gas. The air smelled of ozone and burning metal, and the temperature swung wildly between freezing cold and dangerous heat. Stood at the entrance and whistled low. That's a big reactor. Tugged at his hand proudly. I told you, bigger than your whole ship. You weren't lying, kid. The old chief engineer pushed past them with obvious irritation. Human, this is the heart of our vessel. The technology here is beyond anything your primitive species has ever created. Our plasma matrices were designed by the greatest minds of the Empire. They require precise calibration, exact components, materials that cannot be found outside our. He gestured at the failing systems with one weathered claw. You cannot fix this with your little box of tools. Did not argue. He just walked forward, his eyes moving over the damaged systems with the careful attention of a man who had spent his whole life looking at broken things. He set down his toolbox, pulled out a flashlight, and stuck it between his teeth. Then he started climbing. "What is he doing?" demanded. "Looking," said, as if it was obvious. Climbed over conduits and squeezed between crystal pillars, moving with surprising ease for a creature with no wings and no claws. He stopped at a junction point where three major plasma lines came together, examined it closely, then moved on. He found a cracked crystal matrix, touched it gently, shook his head, and kept going. For almost an hour, he explored the reactor chamber while the engineers watched in confused silence. Finally, he climbed back down and spat out his flashlight. "Okay," he said. "Good news and bad news. Bad news is your main coupling is shot and your plasma regulators are about to blow. Good news is I can fix it." Crest rose in disbelief. "Impossible. The coupling alone requires crystalline components that must be grown in zero gravity over a period of months. The regulators need rare isotopes that exist only on 3 worlds in the cluster, all of which are now controlled by the collective." Yeah, well, opened his toolbox and started pulling out items: wire, metal tape, a welding torch, a handful of strange components that looked like they had been salvaged from a dozen different machines. "I'm not going to do it the fancy way." He climbed back up to the damaged junction point, and the engineers watched in horror as he began to work. The human did not repair things the way did. He did not replace broken parts with perfect copies. He did not follow any design or plan that the engineers could recognize. He simply looked at what was broken, figured out what it was supposed to do, and then found a way to make it do that thing using whatever materials he had on hand. A cracked crystal matrix was bypassed entirely, its function taken over by a loop of copper wire wrapped around a piece of metal from his own ship. A leaking plasma conduit was sealed not with proper welding compound, but with layers of metallic tape that somehow held against temperatures that should have melted it instantly. A burned-out regulator was replaced by something built on the spot out of spare parts, a device that looked like garbage but hummed with steady power when he plugged it in. "This is madness," muttered, watching the human work. "He is destroying our systems." But sitting on a pile of cables nearby shook her head. "No, he is fixing them. Watch." And it was true. Everywhere worked, systems that had been dark began to flicker back to life. Power flowed through paths it was never meant to travel, but it flowed. The reactor's dying pulse grew slightly stronger. The air grew slightly warmer. On the second day, became persistent. She had been watching him so closely that she began to anticipate what he needed, handing him tools before he asked for them, holding components in place while he welded, crawling into spaces too small for him to reach and making repairs under his direction. "You're a natural," told her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Ever think about being an engineer?" "My mother says I should be a warrior," said, "or a diplomat, something important." Engineering is important, tightened a connection and watched it spark to life. Engineers keep people alive. They solve problems. They make things work when everyone else says it's impossible. He looked at her with those small, dark eyes. "That's pretty important if you ask me." "Thought about this. Why do you fix things?" The human paused in his work. For a long moment he was quiet and worried that she had asked something wrong. Then he spoke, and his voice was softer than before. "Because broken things don't have to stay broken," he said. "Everything can be fixed or at least made to work a little longer. You just have to be stubborn enough to try. You have to look at something that everyone else has given up on and say, no, not yet. There's still a chance." He smiled at her, a tired but genuine smile. "My father taught me that. He was a mechanic too, back on Earth. Spent his whole life fixing things that other people threw away." "Even empires?" asked. "Can broken empires be fixed?" Was quiet again. He looked around at the reactor chamber, at the ancient technology of a civilization that had ruled the stars for longer than humanity had existed. Then he looked at the little dragon girl who had lost everything but still had hope in her eyes. "Even empires, little one," he said. "Even empires." On the third day, the reactor stabilized. On the fourth day, it roared back to life. The sound it made was not the elegant hum of properly functioning technology. It was rough and uneven, with clicks and whines that made the engineers cringe. But it was the sound of power, the sound of heat returning to frozen corridors, the sound of air flowing through recyclers that had been silent for too long. The sound of life. Stood before the reactor, his old eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. "It should not work," he whispered. "By every principle of engineering, it should not work." Sat on the floor nearby, too exhausted to stand. His hands were burned in places where plasma had leaked past his makeshift seals. His jumpsuit was torn and covered in grime. He looked like he had not slept in days, because he had not. "But it does work," he said simply, "and that's what matters." Sat beside him, her small body pressed against his side for warmth. She had not left him for 3 days. She had watched and learned and helped, and now she looked at the living reactor with the same wonder as old. "You did it," she said. "You fixed us." Put a burned hand on her head, gentle despite the pain. "We did it, kid. We fixed it together." The warmth spread through the like blood returning to frozen limbs. In corridors that had been silent and cold for weeks, began to stir. They emerged from their cramped quarters where they had huddled together for heat, their scales dull and their eyes tired but alive. They felt the warm air on their faces, and many of them wept. Walked through her ship and watched her people come back to life. Children who had been too cold to play ran through the corridors, their laughter echoing off walls that no longer dripped with ice. Elders who had prepared themselves for death straightened their backs and began to speak of the future. Warriors who had lost all hope looked at their weapons and remembered what it meant to fight. She found in the engine room, slumped against a wall with his eyes closed. He looked terrible. His skin was pale beneath the grime, and his hands were wrapped in bandages that were already soaked through with blood and plasma burns. He had pushed himself far beyond what his body could handle, and now he was paying the price. "You saved us," said. Opened his eyes slowly. It seemed to take great effort. "Bought you time is all," he said, his voice rough and weak. "Ship needs a proper refit when you reach port. What I did in there, it'll hold for now, but it's not permanent. You need real repairs, real parts." Lowered herself to sit beside him on the cold metal floor. It was not dignified behavior for a high matriarch, but dignity seemed less important now than it had before. This human had saved her people. The least she could do was sit with him. "We have no port to reach," she said quietly. "We have no allies. The Silicate Collective has spread lies about us across the cluster. They say we are conquerors who deserve our fate. They say helping us will bring their wrath down on anyone foolish enough to try." Her voice cracked slightly. "We are refugees without a refuge." Was quiet for a long moment. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, watching the pipes and conduits that he had worked so hard to repair. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. It projected a map of stars into the air between them. "There," he said, pointing at a small dot on the edge of the map. "Junction. It's a station in neutral territory about 11 days from here at your current speed. Run by a coalition of species that the big powers don't care about. Traders, refugees, people who fell through the cracks of the galaxy." He looked at her. "They take in anyone who needs help. I've done business there for years. They're good people." Studied the map. The station was in an area of space she had never visited, far from the old borders of her empire. It was small and insignificant by standards, but it existed, and it was willing to help. "Why would they help us?" she asked. "They do not know us, they owe us nothing." "They don't help because they owe," said. "They help because that's what people do, or what people should do anyway." He smiled weakly. "Besides, I'll vouch for you. I know the station master. She owes me a few favors." "You would do that? Speak for us to your people." "My people," laughed, then winced in pain. "Humans aren't really my people. I've been out here in the black for 30 years, longer than most humans live in one place. I don't have a nation or a tribe or whatever you'd call it, just a ship and a reputation for fixing things." He looked at her and his eyes were serious despite his exhaustion. "But yeah, I'll speak for you. I'll lead you there myself." Did not understand this creature. By every measure her people used to judge worth, he was insignificant. He was small and weak and alone, with no empire behind him and no power to call upon. He had nothing to gain from helping them and everything to lose. And yet here he was. "Why?" she demanded, the question bursting out of her with more force than she intended. "Why do you help us? You risk yourself for strangers. You work yourself to exhaustion for people you had never met before this week. What do you gain? What is your purpose?" Considered the question carefully. He did not answer right away and appreciated that. It meant he was taking her seriously. "I don't know if I have a purpose," he finally said. "Humans aren't like you. We don't have ancient bloodlines or sacred duties. Most of us just kind of figure it out as we go along." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I know what I believe. I believe that when someone's in trouble and you can help, you should help. Simple as that. I believe that broken things can be fixed and lost causes can be found. I believe that the universe is cold and dark and doesn't care about any of us, so we have to care about each other." He looked toward the door where a small figure had appeared, stood there, watching them with her golden eyes. "And I believe that when a little girl looks at you and says you can help, you don't prove her wrong," smiled at. "You do everything in your power to be worthy of that faith." Walked over and sat down on the other side, creating a strange picture. The ancient dragon queen and the little dragon child, flanking the battered human mechanic like an honor guard. "Mother said, is going to lead us to safety," he promised. "I heard," looked at her daughter, then at the human, "and you trust him." Nodded without hesitation. "He fixes things. He does not give up. He is stubborn." She said this last word with obvious approval, as if stubbornness was the highest virtue she could imagine. Laughed again, and this time it did not seem to hurt as much. "She's got me figured out, matriarch. Stubborn is about right." Felt something shift inside her. It was like a flame catching in her chest, small but warm. She had thought that flame was dead, smothered by grief and loss and the weight of impossible responsibility. But here it was, sparked back to life by an alien creature and her own daughter's faith. "Very well," she said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in months. "We will follow you to this station. We will trust you with the lives of our people." She reached out and placed her clawed hand over his bandaged one, careful not to cause him more pain. "And when we have found safety, when our people have a chance to rebuild, we will remember. Do not forget those who helped them in their darkest hour." Looked at her hand covering his, dragon and human joined in that simple gesture. "I don't need to be remembered," he said. "I just need you to survive." "We will survive," promised. "Because of you we will survive, and one day we will do more than survive, we will rise again." Outside the engine room, this repaired systems hummed with rough but steady power. The ship turned slowly toward a distant point of light, toward Junction and the hope of sanctuary. Behind them lay the ashes of an empire. Ahead lay uncertainty and struggle and the long road to recovery. But they were alive, they were moving, they had a destination. And they had a stubborn human leading the way. The journey to Junction took 11 days. 11 days of battered freighter flying alongside his voice crackling over the communication system to guide them through shipping lanes and past potential dangers. 11 days of repairs and rest and slow recovery. They learned things about their human savior during those days. They learned that he slept only 4 hours at a time and spent the rest working on one system or another. They learned that he ate strange food from sealed packages that he called rations and made faces when he tasted them. They learned that he sang to himself when he worked, old songs in a language none of them understood, songs that sounded sad and hopeful at the same time. They learned that he was alone. No family, no clan, no people waiting for him somewhere. Just a man and his ship and the endless dark between stars. Spent most of those 11 days at his side. She helped him with repairs, asked him endless questions about human culture and history, and told him stories about her own people in return. Listened to everything with genuine interest, laughing at the funny parts and growing quiet at the sad ones. "Will you stay with us?" asked on the ninth day, when we reached the station. Was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, kid. I've got my own life out here, jobs to do, places to be." He saw her face fall and quickly added, "But I'll make sure you're settled, make sure you're safe. That's a promise. And then you will leave." "And then I'll leave." He knelt down to look her in the eyes. "But I'll come back, I'll check on you, that's a promise too." Considered this. Then she reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out something small and bright. It was a crystal, no bigger than a human thumb, glowing with soft inner fire, the last light of a dead world. "This is all I have left of home," she said. "My father gave it to me before." She stopped. She did not need to finish. "I want you to have it." Stared at the crystal. "I can't take this, it's too important." "That is why I want you to have it." She pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it. "So you will remember us, so you will come back." On the 11th day, Junction appeared on their sensors. It was not much to look at. A collection of old stations and platforms bolted together over centuries, orbiting a dying red star. But to the refugees, it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. What they did not expect was the fleet waiting for them. 20 ships hung in space near the station. Human ships, all of them. Freighters and cargo haulers, and one battered old warship that looked like it had fought in a dozen campaigns. They were arranged in a loose formation, like an honor guard waiting to receive royalty. "What is this?" demanded, her claws tightening on the arms of her command chair. "What is this?" His voice came over the communication system, and for the first time since they had met him, he sounded embarrassed. "I called ahead, told some people what was happening. Word spread." "Word spread." "Humans are like that," he said. "We hear about people in trouble, we want to help. Can't really explain it better than that." The ships began to move, falling in alongside the like an escort. Messages flooded the communication channels. Offers of supplies, medical equipment, food, fuel, technicians willing to help with repairs, families offering to share their homes on the station until they could find their own space. Listened to it all with growing disbelief. These were not soldiers or diplomats. They were ordinary people, traders and mechanics and miners and families. They had come because one of their own had asked, because strangers were in need, because that was apparently what humans did. "I do not understand your people," she finally said. "Join the club," replied. "I've been human for 53 years and I still don't understand us half the time, but this is who we are. We fight each other, we argue, we do terrible things sometimes. But when it matters, when people really need help, we show up." His voice was warm despite the static of the communication system. "Welcome to the human family, matriarch, such as it is." The docking took hours. It was too large for the station's bays, so she was secured to an external platform while smaller ships people and supplies back and forth. Refugees stepped onto the station deck and were met by humans who pressed food into their hands and showed them to warm places to rest. There was a feast that night in the station's central hall. It was not a grand affair by standards, just long tables covered with simple food and drink, but it was given freely and with genuine joy. Humans and sat together, struggling to understand each other through translators, sharing stories and laughter and tears. Found at a corner table, away from the crowd. He was drinking something from a metal cup and watching the celebration with a small smile on his face. "You did this," she said, sitting across from him. "I just made a few calls, they did the rest." He took another sip of his drink. "Told you, humans are weird." "Humans are wonderful," corrected, "and terrifying. You are small and soft and live such short lives, and yet you move the universe with your stubbornness." She reached across the table and took his hand. "My people will not forget this. When we rebuild, when we rise again, we will carry this memory with us. The day the humans came. Appeared then, squeezing onto the bench beside with a plate piled high with food. She was grinning, her scales flushed with warmth and happiness, looking more like a child than she had since the war began. "Says we can stay here," she announced. "He says the station council has agreed. We can build homes, we can start again." She looked at, "Will you help us?" Looked at the little dragon girl who had believed in him from the first moment. He looked at her mother, the proud queen who had lost everything and found strength anyway. He looked at the hall full of his people and hers, coming together in the way that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Yeah," he said, and his voice was thick with something he could not name. "Yeah, I'll help, for as long as you need me." Years later, long after they had built a new colony around Junction, long after they had begun the slow work of reclaiming their worlds from the Silicate Collective, they told stories about those early days. They told of the stubborn human mechanic who had fixed their dying ship with wire and tape and sheer determination. They told of the little girl who had seen hope where others saw only death. They told of the fleet of strangers who had come because helping was what humans did. And in the great hall of the new council, beside banners that told of 12,000 years of history, there hung a simple portrait. A grease-stained human and a little dragon girl, standing together in the engine room of a dying ship, both of them smiling. The inscription beneath it read, "He came because he could, he stayed because she believed." Stood before that portrait on the day of her coronation as the new High Matriarch. She was no longer a child. She was tall and strong and covered in scales that shone like burnished copper. At her belt hung a pouch that still held the tools had taught her to use, even though she had servants now who could do such work for her. She touched the frame of the portrait gently, remembering. Had died 10 years earlier, peacefully in his sleep aboard his old freighter. He had been 93 years old, ancient by human standards. Had been with him at the end, holding his hand as the life faded from those small, dark eyes. "Did I do okay, kid?" he had asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You did everything," she had told him. "You saved us all." He had smiled then, that tired, genuine smile she remembered from the day they met. "Nah," he had said, "you saved yourselves. I just fixed a few things along the way." Now, standing before his portrait, made a silent promise. She would lead her people with the lessons he had taught her. She would remember that broken things could be fixed. She would remember that lost causes could be found. She would be stubborn in the face of the impossible, and she would never, ever give up. That was the human way, and now it was the way too. The flame that had nearly died in the cold darkness between stars burned brighter than ever before. And it would burn forever, fueled by the memory of a mechanic who came because someone was in trouble, and that seemed like the thing to do.